Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Sally Frater, and I am the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Ulrich Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us for Close to Home, tonight's talk with Houston-based practitioner Jamal Cyrus. Close to Home concludes the public programs component for Looking at the Overlooked, the three-person exhibition currently at the Ulrich Museum of Art, which features the work of tonight's speaker along with artists Nathaniel Donay and Rodney McMillan. Looking at the Overlook runs until Sunday, December the 10th, so if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I hope you will find your way over to the museum to see it before the show closes. Tonight's presentation is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Kansas Humanities Council. The Ulrich Museum would like to thank them for their support, as well as the Wichita Public Library for inviting the Ulrich to participate in their year-long series of programs, Candid Conversations, a discussion of race, Wichita. I would also like to thank the Ulrich Museum staff for their assistance in staging Looking at the Overlooked, Director Bob Workman, Preparator James Porter, PR and Marketing Manager Jennifer Lane, Educator Jana Durfee, Operations and Financial Manager Vanessa Smith, Membership and Special Events Coordinator Carolyn Koppel, and Registrar Stephanie Teasley. I would also like to thank Kenya Evans for his assistance and support for this exhibition. Working with a variety of materials that includes photographs, newspapers, archival documents, and found objects, Jamal Cyrus frequently employs gestures of appropriation to activate practices of memorialization and commemoration. Invoking myriad forms of material culture, the artist deftly engages with it to reveal the ways in which it reverberates well beyond the scope of its intended forms and functions, and illustrates how the archive exists within the rubrics of the everyday. In doing so, Cyrus demonstrates the expansiveness of the margins, the rich dynamism that exists in the cultural practices of the American South and the Black diaspora, the deceptive simplicity of the handmade, and that the act of resistance necessitates an unceasing struggle against erasure and the act of forgetting. Jamal Cyrus holds a BFA from the University of Houston and an MFA from the University of Pennsylvania. He has shown his work in group and solo exhibitions at Project Row Houses, the Whitney Museum of Contemporary Art, the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, the Menil Collection, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Institute of Contemporary Art Philadelphia, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, the Museum of Contemporary Art Contemporary Art Detroit, and Prospect New Orleans. His work has been reviewed in publications that include Art Forum, Art on Paper, the New York Times, Blouin Arts Info, and the Houston Chronicle. The recipient of numerous grants and awards, including Art Pace San Antonio, Artist Residency, a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, a Creative Capital Foundation grant, an Artadia Houston Award in Visual Arts, and a Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award. The artist is currently a visiting associate professor at Texas Southern University in Houston. Please join me in welcoming Jamal Cyrus.
Thank you, Sally. And I, of course, want to say thank you to the Ulrich Museum for sponsoring this exhibition and also for inviting me back to talk about my work in the show. It's a quick, stay, but I've had a good time. I really enjoyed myself, and they made it very seamless. So tonight, my talk is called Close to Home. And when Jana asked me for a title for a presentation, I always hate, kind of giving titles for a talk like that because it's pretty difficult. It was also probably like 4 months ahead of time. It was like way far into the future. But I came up with this idea called Close to Home. And really that was based on where the turn my work had made and then, in terms of like where I was receiving inspiration from. But also, but at the same time was related to my initial like beginnings as an artist. So I like a lot of my titles and a lot of the material I work with, I kind of lucked up on that. Something that fell into place and kind of, it provided me with thinking about what I do in a different way, or thinking about a material in a different way, So I'm going to start out with this map of the city of Houston, and this is an older map. Houston was kind of, in terms of political organization, originally organized into wards. And the particular ward that I'm going to talk about as being an importance in my work is this area called the Third Ward. Now, the Third Ward is was really the second place that that blacks started to congregate in Houston, Texas. The first place was a place called Fourth Ward, which was also known as Freedmanstown, and that's kind of the original place that free people of color started to settle when they came into Houston, because they started to push, beyond the bounds of Fourth Ward. As you can see, they're close. They then started to occupy areas of Third Ward. So Third Ward, it's a little bit different than other parts of town. One of the things about Third Ward is that, like, during the time of segregation, it had its own hospital, it had its own university, and if you really talked about institutions in Black Houston, like Third Ward is really the kind of center of that, right? And so because of those kind of components, it wasn't only a working class neighborhood, but also a neighborhood that had various professionals, so health professionals, people who were educators, people who were artists who would entertain that group, and then you had working class people, right? So it was a really nice, it was a nice mix of different kind of classes and views. So the interesting thing about this neighborhood is that in many ways, it really left an imprint, and I guess this is probably the same for many for people with where they grow up. But for some reason, Third Ward and the people who I've met from that area were really imprinted from, really influenced, and kind of left this kind of lasting residue on their lives and in terms of how they thought about the world and connected to their neighborhood. So this, although I did not grow up in Third Ward, I grew up as an artist in this area. And really, I grew up, I was able to have those kind of experiences due to, I don't want to say particular individuals, because it wasn't only them. It was really kind of communities or ways of thinking that these individuals kind of set up. One is Dr. John Biggers, who is known as like a easel painter, but who's also a muralist. But probably one of his most lasting contributions was the establishment of the art department at Texas Southern University, which I happen to work at right now. And one of the really insightful things about Biggers is his ideas about how art was to function, right? So he believed that art could be a tool in education, in consciousness raising, and beautifying. So in beautification and in consciousness raising. And so he really put a lot into his work in terms of like pushing its formal elements, always really trying to push to the next edge, or to innovate, but also in terms of what this work was about and trying to make it into a message that on some level was accessible, but then would take the viewer to another place. A really nice long line of students who would influence me. Fletcher Mackey is one of them. A woman named Alvia Wardlaw really opened up the doors to kind of the world of art history for me. Was also a student of his. And the other one is a gentleman named Rick Lowe. Now, Rick is one of the founders of an organization called Project Row Houses. And in the early 90s, so this is Rick, along with a guy named Jesse Lott, also one of the founders, and another gentleman who has a glove in his hand named Bert Samples. Him and four other gentlemen started this organization called Project Row Houses, in which they basically transformed a dilapidated set of row houses into artist installation areas, and also, and eventually also into housing for single mothers. So one of the interesting things about these two figures is that their work is linked. Although Rick proposes what he does in the perspective or an understanding of this idea of social sculpture, right? This idea coined by Joseph Beuys, it's directly related to John Biggers. Many of John Biggers' paintings were about the area that Rick would set up Project Row Houses in, and also particularly focused in on this, let me see if I can, okay. Focused on this architectural structure here, vernacular architecture, which is called the Shotgun House. And in his research, Dr. Biggers traced the kind of diasporic kind of origins and kind of diasporic line of the Shotgun House, and saw it as being a symbol of the African American family, right? So these were different ways that these gentlemen were building off of Rick would build off the work of Dr. Biggers. And so it really, I want to also say that vision is also part of that neighborhood in some way. It's intertwined with a kind of collective sensibility that exists in that neighborhood. So whether it was at TSU or at Project Row Houses, I was always getting these ideas or this thematic of the social possibility of art making. And in some ways, many ways I kept that up, sometimes more didactic than other times, but this are the places, between these two institutions, TSU and Project Row Houses, I really started to form my ideas about what art is and could be. So we're kind of diving into some of my stuff now, and I will show a few works from the exhibition, but I kind of just laid out some of my favorite works to talk about. I hope that's okay. This is a piece which is called Pride Record Findings Tokyo. This is a series which I'm still working on. It went from starting in 2005, a little bit around the time after I graduated from the University of Houston, and it's kind of gone into the present. I've just really worked on it very slowly. And in terms of an artwork, the piece itself is supposed to, it takes its inspiration from a record store display. Okay, so you would go into a record store and they would have these kind of shelves of records, like 45s and LPs. We'll come back to that in 1 second. But so these are some of the records in the series. There are approximately 20 records altogether. And they tell the story of this, it's a fictional story, but it's a story of a record label called Pride Records. And in my imagination, Pride Records is started shortly after the Detroit Rebellion, and was a way for this group to educate and raise the political consciousness of youth inside of Detroit. So they did this, through their music, And so you have groups like this one is called Sharonda and the Blackstone Queens, Me, My Shining Prince, and the Deep Black Sea. I imagine this is as an image known to everybody. It may not be, may not be recognizing it yet, but it's the image off of the back of the airplane kind of instructions on what happens when the plane crashes. So I took her, I added an afro. So at that time period, of course, everything had to have afros. And then she had this she's holding on to the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? So this particular record, so as I said, I'll step back for a second. So as I said, the covers tell the story of Pride Records, but they also are connected to events within history, right? So you have this kind of fictional and kind of more historical fact kind of play going on. So Pride Records in the idea, or in the story, starts off extremely focused and really trying to communicate its message to urban youth of Detroit. But eventually it gets difficult for them to get their records out, right? So we're not, well, I'm not sure whether this is through distribution but basically money starts to dry up and they have to take someone who is going to pay for their production. And so they go from making this really kind of political music to making music which is more reflective of the time period toward the end. So it goes from let's say 1969 to 1975. And by 1975, many people in the audience know disco is happening. So, we have some disco lovers in the house. In the Pride story, disco is evil, but but it's really, I had to, of course there's some good disco music, but I had to use that within the story to show this transformation that was happening. And really the story of Pride is reflective of the story of many organizations in the late 60s, early 70s. And basically the watering down and the infiltration of their messages, after these years. So that's what I'm working on. All of the sculptures are based on record stores. This was based on a record shop I saw in a blues encyclopedia called Jerry White's Record Shop. Had to do something about it. It's just a great display. So all the Pride records are up here. And then the hand lettering or hand painted signs, which also pop up later. And I think about it as a frieze, because if you think about ancient art, you have the frieze above the entrance, which has this narrative. Sometimes decorative, but also has this narrative tied to it, and that's what I was trying to do at the top of that. So just kind of quickly to go on about some of the records. So Sharonda and the Blackstone Queens. The Blackstone Queens, as I said, these are fictional names, but also tied to real organizations. So there's a gang in Chicago called the Blackstone Rangers that started to be politicized in the late 60s. So this is a reference to them. This is a group called DMFD, 6 Minutes Till Nation Time. And this is roughly early 70s, so I think this is 1970. And what I was, from what you can see, like it's a play off of the Beatles' Revolver album. But what I was trying to get at with this is, although I did not live during that time period, I talked to people during that time period, and a lot of them expressed this this belief that the conditions or the system in America was really about to change, right? And believed that there was going to be a revolution on some level in this country. And so with 6 Minutes Till Nation Time, I really want to kind of express that hope in that belief in change. The Pride story, goes totally different direction, but this is called Towards a Walk in the Sun, and this is by a group called the Dowling Street Martyr Brigade. And many people might recognize this as the Cream Disraeli Gears album, but I did a collage on top of that. The title of the album itself refers to a gentleman that also appears in the work at Looking at the Overlooked, named Carl Hampton, who was this activist that was murdered by the Houston Police Department in 1970. Okay, so in terms of research and in terms of trying to take some of these ideas about history and not just enact them or reproduce them, like the Pride series is like my first attempt at that. This is a piece called The Janitor Who Draws. And so this is a video, which is of me making a drawing. I'm not gonna play the video, but it's like a four-channel video. In the bottom left-hand corner, you would eventually see a janitor moving away the furniture and sprinkling graphite powder on the floor and making this drawing with a broom. This is related to a couple of things. One, it's related to this painting by a gentleman named Palmer Hayden called The Janitor Who Paints. And this was made in 1930, oil on canvas. So Palmer Hayden was one of the Harlem Renaissance artists and left Harlem to go and study in France. And after he received his training, when he came back to the country, of course, he is not able to make it as a painter or make a living as an artist, and so has to take these other odd jobs to make a living. Some people say that's the story of the janitor who paints. Other people say that this was a friend of Palmer Hayden's, and he made a painting of him making a painting of this woman and her baby. But it was interesting to me because it also, around this time, I was looking at this painting. I had kind of just, for one reason or another, kind of like really been into Palmer Hayden for a while, but started looking at this painting again in graduate school. And around that time, I also heard this story about a woman named Ruth Brown, who many people might know was a famous kind of, I would probably say like late 50s R&B singer, had many hits, but because of her tassels with the music or her dealings with the music industry, was left without any money and ended up back in, to the situation of having to be a domestic. And so I was just kind of thinking about these ideas of people who had these kind of amazing talents, right? But who, for whatever reason or the other, maybe society was not ready to accept them in their true role, had to play another function. And so the janitor who draws is part of that. And really, the style of drawing is kind of like this, very like post-minimalist, process-oriented kind of thing he lays out. this is one of the drawings that I made in that fashion. So the thing about the video is that it is tied to a series of drawings I was doing at the time, and also tied to that idea that was in the painting. So this is made from stencils, large paper stencils. This piece was originally so 61 3/4 inches by 80 inches. And around this time, really, I was falling in love with a particular way of drawing, a way of drawing that was performance-oriented, and also random on some levels. Although I worked with a stencil, I kind of saw that in line with some of the other kind of structures that people during this particular period were using. Although it's more, there's a little bit more information in it. One of the problems that I had with making this type of work, and remember going back to how I was trained with at TSU in that Project Row House, is that I always needed to have more information, more information inside of the work. So I eventually stumbled on these FBI memorandums, doing my research for the Pride records, and these were they had a big effect on me because I had never seen these kind of documents before, right? Basically, when you see text, right, and then you see large kind of redactions, blackouts of text, I don't know, to me, it had a large impact. And it was also, so I read it in terms of its historical nature, but also read it graphically. There were just certain kind of graphic parts that that really resonated with me, and I wanted to use them, right? So there's this thing where it has a formal nature to it, but it also has a kind of conceptual nature to it, which maybe some people can recognize and maybe some people can't, but I'm okay with that. I didn't kind of go into to it earlier on, but I originally started dealing with this period of time and kind of making work in order to educate myself about history, or about kind of about art traditions, that were close to me, or what have you. So I was okay with this thing about, on some level, it being legible, and on others, it not being legible. But these were done with stencils, graphite powder, and large brooms. So you can maybe see in certain areas these kind of streaks. These are all kind of signs or remnants of the process. So I would just put these on the floor, shake graphite powder, and then run the broom over it, and it would leave these streakings in the paper. And so this is a piece called Shh, and this was around 2009. So as Sally said, I work in different mediums, was originally trained as a photographer, but by the time I got to undergraduate, was in a photography program, but never used the camera, right? Was more interested in, as she said, appropriating imagery into scanning, into Photoshop. And so I think one of the things that came out of that was really trying to figure out what was behind an image, as well as how do I now display that image, right? What are some of the ways to display that image? And that's when I started to go into sculpture, by how I would then present these images. So this is a photo that's originally taken from one of the Black Panther Party free food giveaways. And originally, it did not have balloons over it, of course. It did not have balloons over everybody's faces. But, thinking about COINTELPRO and thinking about the type of surveillance that was going on at that time period, and it not only affecting key people involved, but infecting other people's day-to-day lives. If you ever watch Good Times, there is a episode in which Michael writes a letter to Fidel Castro, and because of that, James Evans is then released from his job, right? So I'm trying to make a point about I do believe that people who are tangentially associated with the party could also have their lives affected by the surveillance, right? So the reason for this piece, and as well as the title. Okay, so this is a more current work, 2016. If you think about the Pride series, it's really a series about the role and function of art in terms of social transformation, right? These people believe they can make this music that's going to educate youth, that's going to lead to a more equitable society, right? So there are other artists who also really believe this, and because of that, we're also, not fictionally, but also followed by the FBI and came wrapped up in that surveillance. So for bass, Paul is a reference to, to Paul Robeson. And this is as you can tell from the orientation of it, this is in the same format as the American flag, which is kind of flipped upside down, which is a symbol of distress. This area inside of the flag, it's hard to see, but this is laser cut canvas that from documents of Paul Robeson's file, right? So Paul Robeson's, followed by the FBI because of one, he's traveling, but has such a large reach in terms of people who are his audience, right? So he was being followed for this purpose as well as for his being a communist, right? But still, there's this idea of the role of art in social transformation. And so I just started to look more and more into these types of figures, and there are many of them. Many of them are, in terms of what has come out so far, are literary. This is a piece called Explain. This is set up as a rug on the floor, but this is also one of this is the first page of Malcolm X's FBI file. And after looking at these things for so long, I was just always trying to figure out new ways of how to use them. And eventually I started to see they would use this particular template, where they would have different fields for placing information in kind of each section or field. I started thinking about it as a building or as a piece of architecture. And so for me, it then became a ritual space, right? So as you know, this is based on kind of a prayer rug. It's larger than a prayer rug, but it's based on a prayer rug, and so it becomes a ritual space where a person could excavate more information out of the document. Okay, so this is a piece that is in the exhibition next door called BPPGG, and this is based on, so I've made two protective vests. The first one you see in the exhibition, it has the books, right? And the books are there in order to serve as a physical protection, and they're also there to be read by the wearer, right? So to also serve as kind of a mental or psychological protection as well. Now, BPPGG doesn't operate in the same way, but also is is a protective jacket. It's based on the kind of iconic Black Panther leather, I think they call it a field coat, but has these kind of amulets on it. So the amulets are made of pieces of paper that are, so metal wrapped in pieces of paper, well, it's a particular paper, but wrapped in this paper and then placed inside a little leather pouch, and then sewn up, and they're like all over the jacket. I originally started seeing these probably like early 2000s. It's basically a translation from what's called a Malian hunter's vest. And with the idea of the Malian hunter's vest is that they wear these garments, these jackets before they go on a hunt. And the hunt is supposed to, the jacket is supposed to provide them from physical protection, from spiritual protection, but also to kind of hope that they, or make for them to have a successful outing, right? So I was thinking about this garment, and again, about the kind of repression that this particular movement in American history saw, and the need for those different levels of protection in doing this kind of work. So that's where BPPGG comes from. It stands for Black Panther Party Gree, BPPGG. A really important aspect in my work is music. And I often, at least I did earlier today, which I didn't kind of go into with y'all, but there were certain deficiencies that came out of my growing up in the South, at least with the parents I did. One, that I did not acquire a lot of the histories that I make work about, right? I didn't receive that information from them for one reason or the other. And so I had to pursue those in my own time, in my own way. But I did, receive a lot of other things, which I do feel is related to place in a particular culture that existed, around me at the time. And one is the function of music. So I grew up in like a Baptist church. My mother was a gospel singer. My uncle is still a gospel musician. And on Sundays, I basically got to see music transform people from, their everyday kind of normal consciousnesses to something which was outside of that, right? And so early on, like there's this belief, experiential belief in the power of music to really operate on a bunch of different levels, not only entertainment. And so that's really kind of leaked into my into what I do, and it's based on. I eventually saw it as being not based on the idea about music, but the ideas about sound, right? And so this particular piece is called Untitled Grand Verbalizer, and it looks into the drum as an orator, right? The idea that the drum can be an orator or a speaker is an African idea, but also comes into the United States, and is one of the reasons why the drum was outlawed in many places throughout the South, right? Because it's believed that drums could be used to communicate, and drums could be used basically in insurrections, right? So one of the really interesting things about the drum is that there are drum languages, but people don't really, people, at least, people who write about it, they disagree as to what the language is, how they operate, right? Some people believe that there is a drum language, right, that is on its own. Some people believe like drums, there are drums that mimic human language, right? And so they're not certain about how they operate, but there is the belief about the drum languages. So that's what this piece is essentially about, and it's the bass drum as well, right? Which, kind of has this ability to really move the body. Like that's what you kind of, the idea about 4 on the floor, right? That's what you really kind of connect with in terms of when you listen to sound or listen to music. This idea about the bass drum. So again, this one is, a lot of my work I try to take from aspects of this kind of political culture, but then, try to flip in and translate it into another way to where it may not be directly, you can't see it right off. So this piece the drum skin is wrapped in leather, right? It has a natural drum skin on the front and the back, and these microphones are all around it, right? Similar to how certain figures, political figures, might appear at a podium, right, and just kind of be confronted within the mass of microphones, right, that are waiting to hear what they have to say about this or that. So that's what Grand Verbalizer is about. Okay, so around 2012, I started really trying to focus in on areas that were closer to me. Like, so as I said, a lot of my work was about these kind of movements that my parents didn't necessarily kind of participate with. Maybe, my particular city I lived in maybe wasn't that active in, has a history in, but wasn't necessarily that prevalent. But I started to recognize those elements which were there, right, and try to hone in on those things. I saw it as it's still research, but it's like it's a different kind of research, which is basically kind of like 24 hours. Basically, I would try to. Whatever space I might be in, just try to keep my ears open and kind of soak in stories and that kind of thing. So I found out about this group, called the Texas Tenors. And Texas Tenors were this line of saxophonists who played the tenor saxophone. And they all had a particular sound that was associated with them, right? Like, it was basically, they had a kind of style or a kind of like perspective that they all shared in. And it kind of had this really round, kind of soulful, kind of funky kind of tone. So I was listening to Steely Dan and the piece Deacon Blues. And it's really, that piece really opened up. I mean, I'm a jazz person. I always kind of listened to jazz ever since like since I was in high school, really. But started to get into jazz more as the years went by. But Deacon Blues really kind of like helped me to think about jazz as almost like a spiritual tradition, and also thinking about the saxophone as this instrument that provided people with perhaps with money, but also kind of the ability to express themselves or kind of overcome their circumstances. So I did this piece called Texas Fried Tenor. Don't ask me how the saxophone eventually kind of gets fried. It's a funny thing. It's a bunch of little things. I've had a really great time in terms of being an artist, but trying to stay open and just let ideas come in from various angles. Because this is partially related back to the drawing work with the post-minimalist. This is related to stories like I heard from my father about him being a short order cook. And this is also partially related to African sculpture, right? Particularly like this group called the Bambara, who make these great works. And their sculptures, at least some of them, are made, they make offerings to them. And over time, the offerings accumulate and they kind of create this like bubbly kind of patina, that in some ways kind of looks like fried things. So that's where the piece comes from. It's a performance. The piece is prepared a couple of days before, then battered, fried, and then the sound of the frying is kind of what goes to the audience, and I mix in other sounds with that and kind of play with that. I was lucky to do it 3 different times in Radical Presence, so this is an exhibition that toured around the United States. I'm not sure if you got a chance to see it. This is so that was a performance shot. This is an installation shot. What the piece looks like. That's tied to 2 railroad kind of beams. Okay, a couple of newer pieces. A piece called Book Sleeve, Prototype for W.B. Du Bois's Encyclopedia Africana. As you can see, it's a drum skin. Supposed to operate as a thing to bind or hold these books together. Encyclopedia Africana was a series of books that W.B. Du Bois got to work on before his death, but as far as I'm aware, was not completed according to his original vision of it. He basically wanted to tell the entire story of the African diaspora, but did not do that. But in some ways, this piece is similar to Grand Verbalizer in that it also, thinks about these words or these books as drums, and having the ability to communicate, to pass on traditions and what have you. Okay, so this is a series we just call Eroding Witness. So 2 of these pieces are looking at the Overlooked exhibition. These works, they document Carl Hampton's murder, who I talked about in the Pride series as well, with the Dowling Street Martyr Brigade. And these are from 4 different newspapers in Houston, 2 kind of like mainstream newspapers, and then 2 black newspapers. And I was just really kind of interested in, so first this came out of trying to find photographic evidence of that particular period, right? Which I was not able to find as much as I wanted, but was, eventually went to the newspapers, and it was just kind of looking at how the language between the different papers were, and the kind of story that they were all trying to tell. Some which were more nuanced than others. Some were more about trying to just to communicate or transmit just the typical kind of representation of black militants. This piece is in the exhibition next door. It's called Kennedy, King Kennedy. And this is also 3 pages from the front lines of the Chicago Daily Defender. So again, looking into to black presses. In some way, I am, in my work, although I didn't originally see it this way, but I did talk about in terms of educating myself, like am in the process of kind of creating this archive, right, of a particular movement, a particular point in history, an archive that sometimes is centered around words and messages, but at other times, which is more about material, more about feeling, more about image. This is a piece which I originally kind of got the inspiration from, based on that kind of what's called a triptych or trinity of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy that you saw in many people's homes in the late 60s, early 70s. A piece called Duet, another piece about Paul Robeson and Marian Anderson and their surveillance by the FBI, laser cut in papyrus. And this is a piece which was one of the public work which I've done. It's on the corner, I'm not sure what the cross street was. Basically on Main Street, or was on Main Street in downtown. This is a 60 feet by 40-foot image of repeated Lightning Hopkins posters from a place called Liberty Hall, which is an important kind of blues and rock venue in Houston. And with this, I was really thinking about ideas about the crossroads and the crossroads and blues. Lightning Hopkins is also from 3rd Ward and 5th Ward, played a lot in 3rd Ward. So I'm just going to go into a couple of pieces that I've done with an artist group I work with called Otabenga Jones Associates. This is a piece called We Did It for Love. This was for an exhibition called Amalgama. And so I was lucky enough, fortunate enough to meet a group of like-minded people when I was in art school. And, really we were trying to, although, it manifests itself in different ways, we were all trying to get at the same thing in one way or the other in terms of what we wanted our art to do. And so this was one of the first large pieces we did called We Did It for Love, which is it's kind of a memorial, a monument to the Watts Rebellion. And it came out of our research into that particular event and reading how people saw their participation in it out of what seems to be like a really destructive kind of undertaking or happening. Like, that's not how everybody saw it. And in fact, in many ways, the Watts Rebellion, from what we can gather, caused certain kind of artistic or kind of resurgences in that neighborhood. Also tied to this is just the language that's used to refer to those types of events. We, from that point on, did not use the word riot whenever we talked about these kind of situations that happened a lot in the late 60s, early 70s. We always used uprising, we used rebellion, we used kind of descriptive terms that gave more agency to those involved with it. And this is a piece called Lessons from Below, which was, we went to the Whitney Biennial as a collective and as individuals in 2006, called Day for Night. And after we did the Whitney Biennial, the Menil Collection asked us to participate in this series of exhibitions, which they don't do often, where they invite artists to go into their collection and to stage an exhibition based on that. So we did that, and what happened we ended up putting together an exhibition with Franklin Sermons and Michelle White of artifacts from the Menil collection and artifacts from our own collection, right? So there was just a really large mixture of high and low, of fact and fiction, and so aside from that, we would every Saturday invite a particular kind of artist, academic, historian, et cetera, to pick a work in the show and then base their lecture off of that. This is a part of a kind of like it's like a activity packet that we had proposed to do with the High Museum in Atlanta. That was supposed to go to zip codes that were underrepresented in the museum's database. So right as we kind of proposed this, they were like, "Great, we want to do it. We love the idea." After we had made the content, they went back on it. They didn't distribute it out. Who knows what happened? They printed everything, but who knows what ended up happening to those materials? I tried to get access to them or recover them. They did not let me have them. So this was part of a coloring book, and all of this stuff is really based. It was pointed at children. That was the audience, right? But basically, it was these stories that were related to certain aspects of American history, Atlanta's history, that people didn't feel comfortable with disseminating. So I talk about this stuff kind of seriously, but like the Otabenga Jones stuff is not really like my work. I mean, in some ways, it's like my work, but there's a lot more humor in it. So this takes the chair image, or some people might call it the throne image, was very iconic, and asked younger people to choose the correct head that goes on top of that, right? And so, the same way that I didn't get some information from my the previous generation, from my parents, we were trying to pass this information on to younger people. This is a poster that was in the package called Mount Rushmore. And of course, this is based on Mount Rushmore, but this is Sitting Bull, John Brown, Olmec Head, and Harriet Tubman, right? So just thinking about monuments and memorializing this whole other history of America. This is another Carl Hampton piece. Carl Hampton, one of the reasons why I feel like we kept going back to Carl Hampton is that Houston is generally left out of civil rights histories, right? However, when you look at the case of Carl Hampton and others, another gentleman I was talking about earlier today named Leotis Johnson, a lot of things that were happening to these figures were very consistent with what was happening across the country to other activists in the movement. So this is placed on the site right where their party headquarters was located. Funny story about this: they were repaving the road, the sidewalk, relaying the sidewalk in front of the where the house was. It's no longer there, so it's just like in Houston, like this thing, there's not an appreciation for architecture. They don't care about history. They don't care about any. If it's if they want to build something else on it, it's going to get torn down. So if it's now in front of a vacant lot, and so I was afraid that this was going to get lost because they were just pulling up, these big things of concrete, throwing it in a dumpster or whatever. And one morning, I went to see if I could get it, and they had ripped it up, and I was like, damn, I was really kind of upset because these things are really kind of expensive, but also because of the, of the site, I wanted to stay. And the guy who was leading the management of that particular project had kept it, And because of his relationship to the building, the kind of grounds guy at Project Row Houses kept it and was going to reset it into the concrete. I mean, that was just, it was amazing to me because it was, yeah, that would have been lost for sure. So this is some more of the Big Jones stuff. This is a piece which is called OJBK-FM. I'll just kind of go quickly through these. We call this site-specific radio. We have this kind of 1959 Cadillac Coupe de Ville that we sawed in half. Use the back seat as a place where you do interviews and kind of do talks and DJ mixes and all this kind of stuff. Wherever the Cadillac is parked, it does programming or material about that area. All the participants are from that area. It's a mixture of interviewing, pre-recorded sound, and live performance, and trying to get some theater in there. This is another example of it in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. Just quickly, these are a couple of paintings that I've done with a gentleman named Walter Stansel, who's also painted in Third Ward for 40 years or so. And this is a piece that's next door. And, just a couple of words about this. One of the things I've really tried to get to in doing this series is like how these gentlemen see their craft. And what I learned is that very early on, although you had people like John Biggers in the neighborhood, like these guys didn't see this as craft-oriented sign painting. These guys saw this as being artists, right? A lot of them are self-trained, and this is the lane that they saw open for them in terms of if they wanted to pursue a creative career. Now, because of technology and those kind of things, this is, amongst that particular group, it's getting harder and harder for them to sustain themselves. So I tried to work with them. I try to learn from them, and hopefully try to add something new to what they see as a possibility for their work. This is a quote from a Jean-Michel Basquiat painting called Natives Carrying Guns, Bibles, Amorites on Safari. It comes from a little small piece of text that's in that painting. So this series was about kind of re-envisioning, I think I call it reversioning, what I saw to be as important kind of pieces of art from like the text painting or text tradition. So hope I didn't go too long with that. I know that was a lot of work. But if you have any questions, I can take them now. And we can go back over if you want to see anything again. Okay. Yes. Okay, so with the Pride records, I only make the covers. Yeah. Okay. Now, no, I was just saying that because you see. Okay. Records inside? There are records inside. And so, the experience is like you look at it, you see this cover, which is pretty, believable, and then you flip it and you see something totally different. So I kind of like that kind of jarring thing. The Pride Records is complete, but when I was writing the chronology of it, I put Pride Records chronology, known records to date. So I created, if I run across a cover that, or an idea or a photograph or whatever that I have to use, I just want to be able to include that also. So, but for the most part, it's complete. Yeah. Yes.
So who or what are your current inspirations for your current
currently working on at this moment, still the post-minimalist stuff. There's a couple of works that I didn't show y'all that I've been making from old Jet magazines. I don't know if y'all have seen Richard Serra's verb list. The verb list is this kind of list of verbs that basically would kind of give him clues on how to work with a particular material, right? So to fold, to bend, to cut, to screw, like all of this kind of stuff. So I've been working with that. That helps me out. I've also been looking at painters. I'm involved myself. I'm starting to do this series of R&B posters. So Houston, this is the story that has come down to me. So Houston in the 1950s was one of the important sites for R&B, right? So there was a label called Duke Peacock that was run by a guy named Don Roby. And many of the really important figures in blues and R&B went through that label, right? So they were really kind of like a precursor to Motown. Now, Houston does not really focus in very much on that history because we have all this other industry. Basically, we never really needed to make that a part of our character. So you got the oil industry, you got NASA, you got all this other stuff, right? So they really didn't see that as a source of revenue. So in many ways, we haven't really focused on that as a city. But I'm going back and finding all of these blues and R&B posters and making large kind of paintings out of them. Partially which look kind of like the FBI kind of drawing I showed you, but with color and with other materials mixed in, which are influenced also by African sculpture and those kind of things, those kind of processes. What else? Who else is an inspiration that I'm looking at right now? I would say like that's what's on my mind. Like most, like that's the closest thing on my mind right now. So that's what I'm looking at. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You were doing your research and finding these FBI files on certain activists in our country. Did you learn anything? Did you learn more about their lives in reading those files, or did you just learn more about what the FBI thought was important about their lives?
That's an interesting question. I really started to get the sense that the amount of research that they did, particularly with a figure like Malcolm X, right? You could have the autobiography and then you could have his file like run simultaneous, right? So it was basically like just this other kind of telling and documentation of history. That's what I really started to appreciate when as I started to go through that research, just how much it was, and for artists, how much information was there for use, and then like because of what they were doing, there's information that's not going to show up anywhere else, So yeah, I would say like that was the main thing that I really kind of took out of it, was just, in ways I would just say like the richness or the amount of information that was there that could be used. Okay, anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank y'all for coming out.